For 50 years, my husband was the architect of my life, and the architect of my prison. He designed the house we lived in, a monument of glass and steel on a hill overlooking Havenwood. He said it was for the view. I think it was so he could see anyone coming. He chose the furniture, minimalist and cold, pieces that looked better than they felt. He chose my friends, which is to say, I had none. He chose the rhythm of our days, a quiet metronomic beat of his work, his meals, his needs. And then he died. The funeral was as precisely engineered as everything else in his life. Efficient, clean, and utterly devoid of warmth. I stood by the sleek, black casket, a 72-year-old widow in a black dress he'd approved of years ago, feeling nothing but a strange, unnerving stillness. The grief that everyone expected from me was absent. It had been hollowed out long ago, replaced by a quiet, simmering compliance. I was not mourning a husband. I was witnessing the deconstruction of my cage. My son, Jacob, stood a few feet away, his back to me. He wasn't looking at the casket or the mourners. His gaze was locked on the small, glowing screen of his phone, his thumb swiping upward in a repetitive, anxious motion. Stocks, I presumed, or perhaps something else. He was a man perpetually distracted, always searching for the next best thing, the next advantage. He had his father's ambition, but none of his patience. Beside him was Amelia, his wife, my daughter-in-law. She was a masterpiece of modern grooming. Her blonde hair was arranged in a way that suggested effortless grace, but required military precision. Her black dress was couture, her nails a perfect, glossy nude. She moved through the sparse crowd of Richard's business associates with a practiced sympathy, her hand resting briefly on an arm. Her voice, a low, soothing murmur. But her eyes, the colour of a winter sky, were constantly scanning, assessing, calculating. The guests trickled out, leaving behind the scent of lilies and the husks of their condolences. Soon, it was just the three of us in the cavernous living room. The catering trays sat on the marble island, a mosaic of perfect, untouched canapes. The silence in the house was different now. It used to be Richard's silence, heavy and oppressive. Now, it was just empty. Amelia glided over to me, her heels making no sound on the polished concrete floor. She placed a cool, dry hand on my arm. "Elizabeth," she began, her voice like honey laced with ice. "You're being so strong. It's truly remarkable." I said nothing. Strength had nothing to do with it. I was a rock that had been eroded by the sea for 50 years. What was left was simply what couldn't be washed away. "We were just talking," she continued, glancing at Jacob, who finally pocketed his phone but kept his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. "This house, it's magnificent. A testament to Richard's genius." I looked around the room. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the grey Oregon sky. The furniture was arranged in stark, unforgiving lines. It wasn't a home. It was a showroom. "It's a very large space," Amelia said, her tone shifting, becoming more purposeful. "A lot to manage. For one person." There it was. The first tremor. I felt a familiar coldness creep up my spine. The same feeling I'd get when Richard was about to issue a new decree. "I've managed it for 50 years, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. Jacob shifted his weight. "Mom, Amelia's just saying, it's a lot of upkeep. The taxes alone. Your father handled the finances," I stated. It was true. I was given an allowance, like a child. I never saw a bill, a statement, a deed. Amelia's smile tightened. "A fraction of an inch. Of course he did. But now, the responsibility falls to you. And we worry. We wouldn't want you to be burdened. There are some wonderful communities now. Not like the old places. More like resorts. The Golden Pines Estate, for instance. They have a golf course, a pool, chef-prepared meals. It would be a chance for you to relax, to be taken care of, for a change. She made it sound like a gift, a liberation. But I heard the click of a new lock, the closing of a different kind of door. They weren't offering me a resort. They were offering me a shelf to be placed upon, out of the way. I am not a burden, Amelia, I said, looking directly into her cold eyes. And this is my home. Jacob flinched, looking away toward the window. No one said you were a burden, Mom, but his eyes said otherwise. His eyes said, I was an obstacle, an inconvenient piece of emotional luggage left over from a past he was eager to liquidate. The house, this monument to his father's ego, was the real inheritance. I was just the live-in caretaker, whose lease had just expired. Amelia's hand dropped from my arm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with it. Of course, she said, her voice losing its honeyed edge. It's just a thought. We just want what's best for you. The conversation died there, but the words hung in the air, heavy and toxic, like the scent of the dying lilies. The cold front had arrived. I just didn't know the storm was only a week away. That week passed in a blur of disquieting quiet. The house felt enormous, a hollowed-out whale carcass. I found myself walking its halls, touching the walls, trying to find some trace of myself in it. But there was nothing. Every surface, every angle, every shadow was his. Richard's. I was a ghost in a life that was supposed to have been my own. The doorbell rang precisely 1 week after the funeral. Not a gentle chime, but a sharp, insistent buzz. I opened it to find Jacob and Amelia standing on the porch. They weren't dressed for mourning. Jacob was in a crisp button-down shirt, Amelia in a sharp, business-like blazer. She held a leather portfolio. He held nothing, his hands empty and his face a blank mask. They didn't wait for an invitation. They walked past me into the living room, the same room where they had first planted the seed of my disposal. Mom, Jacob started, his voice strained. We need to talk. We've brought some documents, Amelia said, placing the portfolio on the glass coffee table with a soft thud. She unzipped it and slid out a sheaf of papers. It's about the estate. I remained standing by the door, my hand still on the cold metal of the handle. I told you. This is my home. That's just it, Elizabeth, Amelia said, her voice taking on a tone of patronizing sympathy. We've had some things looked at. Richard's affairs. He was a very meticulous man. He had a plan for every eventuality. She slid a document across the table toward the empty sofa. This is his updated will. And this, she added, tapping a second stack of papers, is a durable power of attorney, signed and notarized 3 months ago. My blood ran cold. Power of attorney? Jacob finally spoke, his voice low and firm, echoing his father's cadence. It gives me full control of the estate. Financial and medical decisions. Dad was worried about you, Mom. About your memory. Your ability to manage things on your own. My memory is fine, I snapped, a spark of anger cutting through the fog of dread. What is this, Jacob? Amelia answered for him. It's a formality, Elizabeth. A protection, to ensure the estate your well-being is managed properly. Richard stipulated it clearly. In the event of his death, and, given what the doctors have observed about your declining cognitive state. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Declining cognitive state. Asterisk. It was a cage of words, designed to invalidate me, to render me powerless. They had been planning this. The concerned looks, the talk of a community, it was all a prelude. What doctors? I demanded. I haven't seen a doctor in a year. It's all in the report, Amelia said smoothly, tapping the papers. We don't need to get into the unpleasant details. Jacob looked at me then, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Shame. Regret. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a hard resolve. "We've made arrangements," he said, his voice flat. "At a facility. Oak Haven Meadows. It's very nice. Top-of-the-line care. You're putting me in a home," I whispered. "It wasn't a question. We're ensuring you're cared for," Amelia corrected, her smile a painted slash of red. "We've even packed a bag for you. Just the essentials to get you started." She gestured toward the hallway. And for the first time, I saw it. My small old leather suitcase sitting by the stairs. The one I used for the rare weekends Richard had allowed me to visit my sister years ago. The finality of it was suffocating. They hadn't come to discuss. They had come to inform, to execute. "No," I said. The word, a small, hard stone in the vast emptiness of the room. "Number. You can't." Jacob's composure finally cracked. The mask fell away, and I saw the raw, resentful ambition underneath. "I can," he said, his voice rising. "It's done, Mom. The paperwork is filed. This house, the assets, they're under my control now. For your own good. Get out of my house," I said, my voice trembling but clear. He took a step toward me. "It's not your house anymore. Get out." That's when he broke. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a hostile stranger. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the thin flesh above my elbow. The grip was strong, unforgiving. It was Richard's grip. "The car will be here in an hour," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "You can walk to it, or I can have the orderlies from the facility help you. It makes no difference to me." I tried to pull away, but his hold was like iron. He was stronger than I'd ever imagined. He propelled me forward, out of the living room, toward the front door. I stumbled, my feet catching on the edge of a rug. "Jacob, stop!" I cried out. A raw, pleading sound I hadn't made in years. Amelia watched from the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. He pushed me onto the porch, the cold air hitting me like a slap. He let go of my arm, and I staggered against the railing. He stepped back inside and pushed the small suitcase out with his foot. It skidded across the stone and bumped against my leg. "The locks will be changed by nightfall," he said, his voice cold and final. "Don't try to come back." Then he closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. A heavy, definitive thud. I stood there on the porch of the house I had lived in for half a century. The house where I had raised a son, where I had weathered 50 years of a silent, suffocating marriage. I stood there with nothing but a small suitcase, an old purse, and the clothes on my back. The architect of my prison was dead, but his heir had just locked me out for good. The taxi was a generic anonymous sedan. The driver didn't speak, just nodded when I gave him the address of the only motel I could think of, a place on the outskirts of town called the Pine Cone Inn. As we drove, I watched my life recede in the rear-view mirror. The house on the hill, my prison and my home, grew smaller and smaller until it was just another shape against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial bleach. The bedspread was a thin, scratchy polyester, patterned with faded green pine cones. The single window looked out onto the parking lot, where the neon sign cast a flickering, sickly pink light. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, my small suitcase unopened at my feet. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a vast, hollow ache. But beneath the ache, something else was stirring, a cold, hard anger. And with the anger came the memories. They didn't come as a gentle flood, but as sharp, jagged shards. Memories I had packed away, buried under decades of keeping the peace, of surviving Richard. But now, in the harsh light of this cheap motel room, they refused to stay buried. I wasn't just remembering a controlling husband anymore. I was seeing a monster. The basement. It was always the basement. Richard called it his workshop, his studio. He was a celebrated architect, and everyone assumed it was where he built his models, where he drafted his genius. But the door at the top of the stairs was always locked, not with a simple key, but with a heavy industrial deadbolt he'd installed himself. I remembered arguing with him about it, just once, early in our marriage. "Richard, why must it be locked? What if there's a fire?" I had asked, trying to sound reasonable. He had turned from his drafting table, his face a mask of cold irritation. "It is my space, Elizabeth. It contains sensitive documents, expensive tools. You have the rest of the house. This is mine." His tone made it clear the discussion was over. Forever. I never asked again. But I always felt its presence, a locked secret at the foundation of our home. Then there were the sounds. Faint, muffled sounds that would travel up through the floorboards at odd hours of the night. Sometimes it was a rhythmic thudding. Sometimes a low, keening sound that was almost like a cry, but not quite. "It's just the house settling," he would say, not even looking up from his book. "A house this size makes noises. It's breathing." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I told myself the sounds were the groaning of wood, the shifting of the foundation, the house breathing, as he said. But deep down, I knew, whose don't cry, and the clients. That's what he called them. They were never the wealthy couples or corporate developers you'd expect to see visiting a famous architect. They were always young, mostly women, college-aged, some even looked like they were still in high school. They would arrive in beat-up cars, looking nervous and lost. Richard would greet them at the door with a practiced professional calm and lead them not to his office upstairs, but straight down the hall toward the basement. He called it architectural consulting. Pro bono work, he claimed, for a study on how young people experience architectural spaces. A passion project. I remember one girl distinctly. She couldn't have been more than 19. She had bright, dyed pink hair and a silver ring in her nose. She looked defiant, but her hands were trembling as she stood on the porch. Richard led her inside. An hour later, she emerged alone. The defiance was gone. Her face was pale, blotchy, as if she'd been crying for a very long time. She walked like a marionette whose strings had been cut, stumbling down the path to her car without looking back. She never returned. None of them ever did. I would ask him about them sometimes, trying to sound casual. "Did you help that young woman? The one with the pink hair?" "She was a troubled girl," he would reply, his voice flat and dismissive, confused about her future. I offered some perspective. That's all. But the look in their eyes when they left, it wasn't the look of someone who had received helpful perspective. It was the look of someone who had been broken. A hollowed-out look. A look I recognized, because I saw a version of it in my own mirror every morning. I stood up and walked to the grimy motel window, looking out at the parking lot. The neon sign flickered. Pine Cone Inn. Vacancy. The pieces were all there. The locked room. The strange, muffled sounds he dismissed as the house settling. The endless parade of vulnerable young women who left his presence looking shattered. For 50 years I had accepted his explanations. I had chosen not to see, not to connect the dots, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I had lived under the roof of a man who was not just a domestic tyrant, but something far, far worse. My son Jacob didn't just want the house for its monetary value. The frantic rush to get me out. The fabricated documents. The lies about my mental state. It wasn't just about greed. It was about gaining access. Access to that basement. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over me. My husband's control hadn't just been hiding an overbearing personality. It had been hiding a tomb, a laboratory, a hunting ground. The real question wasn't what my son had done to me in the last week. The real question was what had been happening in that basement for the last 40 years. And what my husband had done to all those girls. The $50 she'd skimmed from the grocery money each week for 40 years felt like a betrayal then, a tiny rebellion. A secret stash for a future she never truly believed would come. Now, sitting in the sterile, glass-walled office of Maya Singh, attorney at law, that betrayal felt like foresight. It was her war chest. The account, under her maiden name, was the only thing in her life Richard hadn't known about, hadn't controlled, and it was about to buy her a fighting chance. Maya Singh was everything Elizabeth wasn't. Young, sharp, dressed in a steel grey suit that looked like armour. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the forged power of attorney documents Elizabeth had placed on the polished mahogany desk between them. There was a professional sympathy in her expression, but underneath it, a familiar weariness. Elizabeth had seen that look before. It was the look people gave. A confused old woman. "Mrs. Blackwood," Maya began, her voice smooth but firm. "These situations are, unfortunately, not uncommon. Family disputes over property after a death can get ugly. The claim of cognitive decline is a classic, if brutal, tactic." Elizabeth straightened her back. She would not be seen as a victim. Not anymore. "I am not confused, Miss Singh. I am angry. That is my home. Richard and I built it. My son Jacob threw me out of it. I understand. And we will fight this. First step is to challenge the power of attorney. We'll file for an immediate competency hearing. It will be unpleasant. They'll have doctors. They'll bring up every time you've forgotten a name or misplaced your keys. They'll have plenty of ammunition," Elizabeth said, her voice flat. Richard had spent a lifetime convincing her she was forgetful, incapable. It was his favorite tool. But the documents Jacob used, the ones giving him the house, they're fake. Maya nodded slowly, tapping a pen on her legal pad. "We'll prove that. But a forged signature on a recent document can be a he said, she said battle. We need something definitive. I've already initiated a full title search on the property at 45 Havenwood Lane. It's a formality, but it gives us a clean baseline of ownership history. We should have the results by tomorrow." She offered a small, reassuring smile. It didn't reach her eyes. She was still seeing a standard case of elder abuse. A sad, messy affair that would end with a settlement and lingering bitterness. Elizabeth just nodded. She knew this was a long shot. She felt the familiar ghost of Richard's voice in her head, mocking her. "You. Against Jacob? You can't even balance a checkbook." Asterisk. For a moment, the fight drained out of her, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of a 72-year-old woman in a cheap motel. The next day, the call came. "Elizabeth? It's Maya Singh. Are you sitting down?" Elizabeth was lying on the stiff motel bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. "I am." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of papers rustling. Maya's professional calm was gone. In its place was something else. Excitement. Disbelief. "I have the title history report." "This isn't a standard case, Elizabeth. This isn't a case at all. It's a nuclear bomb." Elizabeth sat up. "What do you mean?" "The documents Jacob has are forgeries, yes. But not in the way we thought. They're irrelevant. Meaningless." Maya took a deep breath. 30 years ago, on May 17th, 1000, 995, Richard filed a quitclaim deed. He transferred the full, unencumbered title of the property at 45 Havenwood Lane to you, solely to you. Your name, and your name alone, is on that deed. It has been for 3 decades. The room fell silent. Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. No, she whispered. That's not possible. Richard, he would never. He controlled everything. The records don't lie, Maya said, her voice electric. He did, and he never transferred it back. Jacob never bothered to do a real title search. He must have just forged documents, assuming the house was in his father's name, or jointly owned. Legally, Elizabeth, Jacob is a trespasser. He has absolutely no claim to your home. None. We don't need a competency hearing. We don't need to fight. We just need to file an eviction notice and call the sheriff. Victory. It should have felt like victory. But as Elizabeth hung up the phone, a cold dread, far deeper than Jacob's betrayal, washed over her. It was a question, sharp and terrifying, that echoed in the empty room. Why? Why would a man like Richard, a man who savoured control like fine wine, secretly sign away his fortress? It wasn't a gift. With Richard, nothing was ever a gift. It was a move in a game she never even knew they were playing. And she had a horrifying feeling that she was only now beginning to understand the rules. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of Oregon clouds smothering the stars. It was a good night for a ghost. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she slid the old, forgotten spare key into the back door lock. The key Jacob had forgotten existed. The one she'd kept in a small tin box with old buttons and foreign coins for 20 years. The click of the tumbler turning felt unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of her own backyard. The house didn't smell like home. It smelled of Amelia's cloying floral air fresheners and something else. An anxious, sterile cleanliness, as if they were trying to scrub away a stain that wasn't on the surface. She moved silently through the familiar darkness, a phantom in her own life. She ignored the living room, with its new, ostentatious furniture Jacob and Amelia had already bought. She ignored her favourite armchair, the one Richard had always complained about. She ignored the photos on the mantelpiece, their smiling faces now a grotesque parody. Her destination was the door at the end of the hall. The door to the basement. In 50 years she had been down there maybe a dozen times, and never alone. It was Richard's space. My workshop, he called it. The door was different from the others in the house. Solid oak, thick and heavy. And the lock wasn't a simple knob. It was a heavy-duty, industrial deadbolt, the kind you saw on a bank vault, not a suburban basement. He'd installed it himself years ago. He said it was to protect his expensive tools. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth wood, then down to the brushed steel of the lock plate. Her fingers snagged on something. Rough, sharp. She pulled a small penlight from her coat pocket, the one she'd bought at the motel vending machine, and clicked it on. The narrow beam illuminated a series of deep, fresh scratches in the doorframe right next to the lock. Gouges in the wood, raw and splintered. The metal of the lock plate itself was scarred, as if someone had tried to pry it open with a screwdriver or a crowbar. Jacob. It had to be. He had the keys to the house. He had full access. But not to this. This door, Richard's sanctum, had remained locked, and Jacob was desperate to get inside. It was a visceral, physical kind of desperation, etched into the wood of the doorframe. This wasn't just about owning the property. It wasn't about the money. It was about what lay behind this door, a legacy Jacob was trying to claim, and a secret he was failing to unlock. A cold certainty settled in Elizabeth's chest. Whatever Richard was hiding, Jacob knew about it. and he wanted it for himself. The home office was exactly as Richard had left it. Neat, ordered, soulless. A shrine to a meticulous man. Books on structural engineering and classical architecture were arranged by height on the shelves. Blueprints were rolled tightly and filed in labelled tubes. For 2 nights, Elizabeth searched, moving through the room with a methodical patience she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't looking for money or papers. She was looking for an answer to the question that now consumed her. Why? On the 3rd night, she found them, tucked away on the bottom shelf. Behind a row of tedious municipal code books were his personal journals. Not diaries, but thick, leather-bound architect sketchbooks. One for every few years of his career. She opened the one from 1995, the year he'd signed the house over to her. Page after page was filled with his precise, angular handwriting and clean, sharp sketches. Cross-sections of commercial buildings. Stress calculations for bridges. Notes on the tensile strength of concrete. It was the boring, orderly mind of the man she knew. She almost gave up. Then, she saw it. Tucked between a sketch for a public library and a design for a bank facade was a blueprint she recognized. It was their house, but it was wrong. The layout of the main floor was perfect, but the basement was different. In the center of the large, open space Richard called his workshop, there was another room, a smaller, windowless box, drawn with thick, double-lined walls. Beside it, Richard had scribbled notes in his cryptic shorthand: acoustic dampening foam, reinforced concrete, no HVAC connection, and, most chillingly, a small, separate sketch showed a section of the wall between the main basement and the hidden room. It was labelled Observation 1. Way speculum glass. This room did not exist on the official city plans she and Richard had filed 50 years ago. This was a secret, a cancerous growth hidden in the foundation of her life. A soundproofed, unventilated box with a one-way mirror built for a purpose she couldn't or wouldn't let herself imagine. Her hands were shaking as she took a picture of the page with the cheap burner phone she'd bought. As she was about to turn the page, the phone buzzed in her hand, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one had this number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice a dry whisper. "Hello? Grandma?" The voice was young, trembling, and instantly recognizable. Chloe, her granddaughter, Jacob, and Amelia's daughter. "Grandma? Is that you?" "Chloe. Honey, how did you get this number?" I saw Mom looking at your phone records online. She was trying to track your location. I saw you bought a new burner phone and I memorized the number." There was a sob in her voice. "Are you okay?" They're saying you're sick, that you're having delusions." "I'm not sick, Chloe." "I know," she whispered. "I know. It's Dad. He's the one. He's different. Ever since Grandpa died. He's scary." A cold dread trickled down Elizabeth's spine. "What do you mean?" "Scary. He spends all his time down in the basement. Or trying to. I hear him at night, banging on the door. He gets so angry. And the other day, I heard him on the phone. I think he was talking to one of Grandpa's old colleagues. He was talking about continuing the work. He said he had to preserve his father's true legacy. He said the house was essential for it." "Grandma, what legacy?" "Grandpa was an architect." Elizabeth stared at the blueprint on the desk. The secret room. The soundproofing. The one-way mirror. The true legacy. Asterisk. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture of such profound monstrosity that her mind recoiled from it. This wasn't about a workshop. It was about a tomb, and her son, her only child, was trying to find the key. The first blow landed not on her door, but on a screen. Elizabeth was sitting in her motel room, scrolling through the Havenwood community Facebook group on a cheap tablet when she saw it. A post from Amelia. It was a picture of her and Jacob, smiling sadly at the camera. They were standing in front of Elizabeth's rose bushes. Her roses. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom. It's been such a difficult few weeks since we lost Richard. Harder still has been navigating Mom's rapid decline. We're doing our best to keep her safe and comfortable, but her dementia has become aggressive, filled with paranoia and frightening delusions, especially about the family home she can no longer manage. Please keep us in your thoughts as we navigate this heartbreaking new chapter. Number, dementia awareness. Number, elder care number, family first. Underneath it, a curated selection of old photographs. Elizabeth at Chloe's high school graduation, smiling. Richard and a young Jacob on a fishing trip. A Christmas portrait from a decade ago. The whole family arranged in a tableau of domestic bliss. A complete fabrication. The comments poured in, a torrent of sympathy and support. Asterisk. So sorry you're going through this, Amelia. You and Jacob are saints. Asterisk. Asterisk. My mother had dementia. It's a terrible disease. You're doing the right thing. Asterisk. Asterisk. Sending prayers. Let us know if you need anything. Casseroles on the way. Amelia wasn't just a grieving daughter-in-law. She was a popular local influencer. Her Instagram, usually a cascade of tastefully filtered photos of lattes and home decor, had become a public diary of their noble struggle. She posted a tearful video to her story. It's the hardest thing to have to make decisions for a parent who doesn't understand, she said, dabbing a perfectly dry eye. To have them look at you with anger and confusion when all you're doing is trying to protect them, it's a lot. It was a digital smear campaign, a preemptive strike. They were poisoning the well, turning the entire town against her before she could even speak. They were painting her as a crazy old woman, a tragic figure whose words couldn't be trusted. Any attempt she made to reclaim her house, to expose their lies, would be seen through the lens they had so expertly crafted, the ramblings of a paranoid mind. She was being erased, rewritten, buried alive under an avalanche of supportive comments and prayer hand emojis. Sitting there, in the anonymous gloom of the motel, Elizabeth felt a profound and terrifying isolation. They hadn't just taken her house. They were taking her name, her sanity, her truth. There was only one way forward. Through the basement door. She couldn't get a court order without revealing her hand, without looking like the delusional woman Jacob and Amelia were describing. She needed proof. She needed to know what was in that room. She found the locksmith in an online directory. His name was Frank, and his ad promised discreet and professional service. No questions asked. When he arrived at the house the next night, he was a quiet, hulking man with grease-stained fingers and tired eyes. He looked at the heavy-duty deadbolt on the basement door and whistled softly. "What you got in there, lady?" "The crown jewels?" "My late husband was a very private man," Elizabeth said simply. Frank shrugged and got to work. There was no brute force, no crowbar like Jacob had used, just a series of delicate clicks and turns with a tension wrench and a set of slender picks. He worked with the focused calm of a surgeon. The silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the faint metallic scrape and click of his tools. It took him 20 minutes. Finally, there was a loud, satisfying thunk as the deadbolt retracted. "There you go," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. He packed his tools, took the cash Elizabeth handed him, and left without another word. Elizabeth stood before the open door. her heart hammering against her ribs. The air that wafted out was cold, sterile. It smelled of bleach and old, stale air, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old pennies. A scent of cold, clean decay. She pushed the door open. This was no workshop. The room was large, concrete, and empty, but for a single wooden chair placed in the center. The walls weren't bare concrete. They were covered in thick, grey acoustic foam, the kind used in recording studios. It swallowed the sound of her footsteps, creating an unnerving, dead silence. And then she saw the far wall. It was a giant pane of dark, reflective glass, stretching from floor to ceiling. A mirror. She stepped closer, her own reflection emerging from the gloomer, tired, frightened old woman. She pressed her hand against the cold surface. It wasn't a mirror. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was one-way glass. This was an observation room. Her eyes frantically scanned the walls, the seamless foam. Where was the safe? Richard loved safes. He had one in his office, one hidden behind a painting in their bedroom. There had to be one here. Her fingers scrabbled at the acoustic panels, searching for a seam, a break in the pattern. She found it behind the single wooden chair. A section of foam that felt different. A square panel that was not glued down. She pulled at it, and it came away, revealing a small black metal door set flush with the concrete. A wall safe. It wasn't even locked. Richard, in his arrogance, must have believed no one would ever get past the first door. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely turn the handle. The safe door swung open with a soft hiss. There was no money inside. No bonds. No jewelry. There was only a stack of antique audio reels, the kind from the 60s and 70s, neatly labelled with dates and single initials. And underneath them, a single heavy photo album, bound in unmarked black leather. She took them. She put the foam panel back in place, walked out of the silent waiting room, and pulled the heavy door shut. She didn't lock it. She left it open. An invitation. The motel room felt like a confessional, the only light coming from a single bedside lamp. The reel-to-reel player she'd ordered from an online auction site sat on the small table, an archaic piece of technology for an archaic evil. She'd threaded the first tape, her fingers clumsy. The label read, Jan 1000, 980, 2, KL. She pressed play. The slow, rhythmic whir of the tape filled the room. Then, a voice. Richard's voice. Calm, patient, hypnotic. The voice he used when explaining a complex blueprint or soothing a difficult client. Let's go back to the beginning, Catherine, he said. Tell me again about your father. Tell me how he never saw you, how you were invisible in your own home. A ghost in the machine. A woman's voice answered, hesitant and fragile. He just didn't care. He was always busy. I was a disappointment. No. Richard's voice was a soft caress. You weren't a disappointment. You were an inconvenience. A loose thread. People don't like loose threads, Catherine. They want to snip them off. Make things neat. Tidy. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't therapy. This was a dissection. Over the next hour, she listened in mounting horror as Richard methodically, sadistically dismantled a young woman's psyche. He used her deepest insecurities, her most painful memories, as weapons against her. He twisted her reality, convincing her that she was worthless, broken, a burden to the world, that her only value lay in her complete and total submission to him. It was psychological torture, delivered in the patient, reasonable tones of a trusted mentor. The tape ended abruptly. Elizabeth sat in the humming silence, the man's voice still echoing in the room. Catherine L. Asterisk. She knew that name, Catherine Larson, a girl from a neighbouring town who had vanished in the winter of 1982. The police had called her a runaway, a troubled kid from a bad home. There was a brief, cursory search, and then she was forgotten. With trembling hands, Elizabeth reached for the black leather album. She opened it to the first page. It was a photograph of a young woman with haunted eyes and blonde hair. She was sitting in a bare, unfurnished room. The room from behind the glass. She was posed like a broken doll, her expression vacant. Underneath the photograph, in Richard's precise script, was the caption, Catherine Larson, January 1982. Project complete. Asterisk. She turned the page. Another woman. Another name. Another date. Sarah P. June 1987. Asterisk. She remembered that one, too. A college student who disappeared after a fight with her boyfriend. Page after page she turned. A gallery of lost souls. A dozen women, spanning 40 years. Each one reported missing. Each one dismissed as a runaway. A troubled soul who had simply walked away from her life. Each one photographed in that same room, in a staged, ritualistic pose of utter despair. The house wasn't a home. It was a hunting ground. The basement wasn't a workshop. It was a laboratory. And her husband, Richard Blackwood, the respected architect, the pillar of the community, was not just an abusive man. He was a monster, a collector of people, a serial predator who had used the foundation of their lives to build a tomb. And Jacob, her son, knew. He knew, and he called it his father's true legacy. Elizabeth closed the album, the cold leather like a slab of ice against her skin. The grief she thought she had felt at Richard's funeral was nothing. This was a new kind of grief, a bottomless abyss. Every memory of her 50-year marriage was a lie. Every shared moment now tainted with the silent screams of the women on the tapes. She was not just the wife of a cruel man. She was the keeper of a graveyard. The hiss of the ancient air conditioner in the motel room was a serpent's whisper. It was the only sound, a constant, low drone that should have been soothing but instead felt like a placeholder for the silence she had lived in for 50 years. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the worn floral comforter rough against her fingertips. She stared at the blank television screen, seeing nothing but her own reflection. A ghost in a strange room. She had been picking at the loose threads of her memory for days, pulling at names, dates, sounds, trying to weave them into something that made sense. The tapes had given her the what. The blueprints had given her the where. But she still didn't have the why. Why Jacob? Why would her son, her own flesh and blood, be so desperate to protect this mausoleum of cruelty? Greed felt too simple, too hollow an explanation. It didn't fit the frantic, almost religious fervour in his eyes when he'd spoken of the house. She closed her eyes, and the drone of the AC unit shifted, deepened, becoming the familiar, oppressive hum of the basement. Not the sound she heard from the kitchen, but the sound she'd heard once, just once, when she had dared to press her ear against the thick oak door. And then another memory, one she had buried so deep it felt like tearing through flesh to retrieve it, broke the surface. It wasn't a sound that brought it back. It was a smell. The sharp, metallic scent of Richard's cologne, the one he wore only on Sundays. And sawdust. He'd come upstairs smelling of sawdust and that cologne. It was a Saturday. No, a Sunday afternoon. Jacob was 15. He'd had a fever the night before, and she had told him to stay in bed. She had gone to church alone, leaving Richard at home to catch up on some paperwork. When she returned, the house was quiet. Too quiet. She called for Jacob, her voice echoing in the hall. No answer from his room. A knot of maternal anxiety tightened in her stomach. She checked the living room, the kitchen. Nothing. Then she heard it. A murmur from downstairs. Not from the main basement area, but from behind the workshop door. She had crept down the stairs then. Her church shoes silent on the worn wooden steps. The humming was louder here. The door was slightly ajar. Just a crack. In 50 years, she had never seen that door unlocked, let alone open. Curiosity, stronger than her fear of Richard's temper, pulled her forward. She peered through the gap. The smell was stronger here. Cologne, sawdust, and something else. Something clean and cold. Like a hospital. She saw the back of Richard's head. He was sitting in a leather chair, facing away from her, towards the far wall. But it wasn't a wall. It was glass. Dark glass, reflecting the single bare bulb overhead, and standing beside him, not sitting, but standing at attention like a soldier, was Jacob, her son. He wasn't sick. He was dressed. His hair was combed. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his narrow shoulders rigid. He wasn't looking at his father. He was staring, utterly transfixed, at the glass. For a moment she thought they were watching a movie. A strange, silent film projected onto a screen. But there was no flicker, no movement of light. There was just the glass. And on the other side of it, in the dim room beyond, she could just make out a shape. A person. A woman. Sitting on a simple stool, her head in her hands. She couldn't see the woman's face. Only the cascade of long, dark hair. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She should have screamed. She should have thrown the door open. She should have done something. But she was paralyzed by the look on her son's face, reflected faintly in the glass. It wasn't horror. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was fascination. A deep, chilling, academic focus. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips slightly parted. He was studying, learning, absorbing. He was a student in a lecture hall, and the silent, weeping woman on the other side of the glass was the subject of today's lesson. Richard murmured something, his voice too low for her to hear the words, and gestured toward the glass. Jacob nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin, never taking his eyes off the scene. He was an apprentice. He was his father's heir. The house wasn't about money. It was a temple, a sanctuary for their shared, monstrous faith. The secret wasn't something to be buried. It was a legacy to be continued. The memory snapped shut, leaving Elizabeth gasping for air in the cheap motel room. The hiss of the AC was just an AC again. The reflection in the television was just her own tired face. But everything had changed. The grief she felt for the son she thought she knew was cauterized, replaced by something cold and hard and sharp. A purpose. She picked up her phone. The screen illuminated her face with a pale, cold light. She dialed Maya Singh. Maya's voice was crisp, professional, even late in the evening. "Elizabeth? Is everything all right?" "I know why he wants the house," Elizabeth said, her own voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a judge pronouncing a sentence. "It's not for the money. It's to continue his father's work." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, heavy silence. Maya was smart. She didn't need the details spelled out. "Oh, Elizabeth. Oh, God. I need to set up a meeting," Elizabeth continued, as if she hadn't heard. "A final one. At the house." "A meeting? For what?" "We have the deed. The police report about the forged documents. We can move forward with eviction and pressing charges. You don't need to see him again." "Yes, I do," Elizabeth insisted. "We'll frame it as a mediation." A final offer. Tell his lawyer I'm tired. Tell them I'm fragile and feeling the pressure from the community. Tell them I'm willing to sign the house over to him, to stop the fighting. Elizabeth, what are you talking about? Sign it over? After everything, that's insane. It's not insane, Maya. It's a trap. I'm going to give him his inheritance. His full inheritance. But I need you to set it up. Make it look official. Make them believe they've won. I don't like this, Maya said, her voice tight with concern. This feels dangerous. Living in that house for 50 years was dangerous. Elizabeth countered, a sliver of steel in her tone. This is just balancing the books. Tell them I have one condition, that he and Amelia meet me there, in person, to sign the final papers and receive an heirloom. Something Richard wanted him to have. An heirloom? That's what I'll call it. Please, Maya, do this for me. Send an official email. Propose a time. Friday afternoon. Make it sound like you've talked me into it, that you think it's the best course for a woman in my delicate state. Maya was silent for another long moment. Elizabeth could hear her breathing, the soft click of a keyboard in the background. Okay, Maya said finally, her voice resigned but resolute. Okay, Elizabeth, I'll set the table, but you need to be damn sure you know what you're serving. Oh, I do, Elizabeth said, looking at her own steely eyes in the dark screen of the television. It's a dish 50 years in the making. The next 2 days were a blur of meticulous, cold-blooded planning. The first step was a trip to a sprawling 24-hour superstore on the other side of town. Under the humming fluorescent lights, surrounded by families buying groceries and electronics, Elizabeth felt invisible. She paid cash for a cheap prepaid burner phone, the kind that came in a hard plastic blister pack. She bought a new SIM card with it. Back in the motel, she activated it, her fingers surprisingly steady as she followed the instructions. The phone blinked to life with a cheerful, generic chime that sounded obscene in the grim silence of the room. The second step involved her granddaughter. She called Chloe from her regular phone. Chloe, darling, I need your help with something on your little TikTok device. Chloe's voice was warm, a welcome contrast to the coldness coiling in Elizabeth's gut. Gram. Of course. What's up? You trying to learn the latest dance craze? Something like that, Elizabeth said dryly. There was a journalist you showed me once. A woman. She investigated that city council scandal in Portland. Oh, Lena Petrova. Yeah. She's a total badass. She doesn't work for some big network. She's independent. Her TikTok is basically just her dropping bombshells on corrupt rich guys. Why? I need her name, the spelling, and I need to know who to contact at the state police, not the local Havenwood department. Someone higher up, a specific department, if you can find it. Homicide, cold cases, something like that. Gram, what's going on? Chloe's voice was laced with worry. You sound different. I'm just tying up loose ends, my love. Can you do that for me? Of course. A few minutes later, a text came through with the information. Lena Petrova, and a general contact line for the Oregon State Police Major Crimes Section. Elizabeth transcribed the information onto a motel notepad. Then, she picked up the burner phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was the point of no return. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of stale coffee and disinfectant. She composed the first message, addressed to the state police tip line. The words were sparse. Clinical. The missing girls of Havenwood. The answers are in the basement. 488 Cedar Lane. Friday, 3 p.m. The heir will be there. to claim his inheritance. She copied the text. Then she opened the TikTok app she'd made Chloe install on the burner phone. She found Lena Petrova's profile. A sharp-faced woman with intelligent, unblinking eyes stared back from the screen. Below her professional headshot was a contact email for tips. Elizabeth pasted the same message into a new email. She read it over and over. Cryptic enough to be intriguing. Specific enough to be actionable. She hit send on both. Then she switched the burner phone off, snapped it in half over her neath. Crack of the plastic was loud and final, and pulled the SIM card out with her fingernail. She wrapped the two halves of the phone and the tiny card in a cheap motel towel and walked to the gas station across the street. She dropped the bundle into the bottom of a trash can overflowing with fast food wrappers and coffee cups. As she walked back to her room, she didn't feel fear or anxiety. She felt light. The weight of 50 years of silence was beginning to lift. On Friday, the air was thick with the promise of rain. The sky over Havenwood was a bruised purple grey. Elizabeth arrived at the house an hour early. She used her old key, the one Jacob hadn't known about, and let herself in. The air inside was stale, holding the ghosts of old arguments and unspoken truths. Amelia's touch was everywhere new. Sterile-looking cushions on the sofa, a minimalist vase on the mantel where Elizabeth's cluttered collection of family photos used to be. They had erased her, but they hadn't erased Richard. His presence still lingered, a stain that could never be scrubbed clean. She walked through the silent rooms, her final tour. In the kitchen, she ran a hand over the butcher block island where she had prepared thousands of meals. In the living room, she stared at the empty wall where a portrait of a smiling young Jacob had once hung. They had taken that too. Her final destination was the basement. She descended the stairs, her hand gripping the cool, dusty railing. The door to the workshop stood there, silent and imposing. In her bag, she carried a small, portable, reel-to-reel player she had bought from a vintage electronics store, and a single, unlabeled tape from the safe. She had listened to it only once. In the dead of night at the motel, her body rigid with a horror that was beyond tears. She knew its contents by heart. She entered the observation room. It was just as she remembered it from her vision. Cold and sterile. The one-way mirror was a black, fathomless void. She placed the tape player on the small metal table in the center of the room. She threaded the tape carefully, her movements precise and unhurried. She checked her watch. 2:55 p.m. They would be here any minute. She stood by the table, her back to the door, and waited. The sound of the front door opening upstairs was followed by the murmur of voices. Jacob's, low and confident. Amelia's, high and triumphant. Their footsteps were heavy on the floorboards above her, the sound of conquering invaders. "Mother?" Jacob called out, his voice laced with a false, saccharine concern. "We're here. Maya said you wanted to talk." Elizabeth didn't answer. She heard them walk through the living room, their steps slowing as they realized she wasn't there. "Where is she?" Amelia whispered, a hint of irritation in her voice. "This is ridiculous. Just leave the papers on the counter." "No," Jacob said. "She said she had something for me. An heirloom." His voice was closer now, at the top of the basement stairs. "Mother, are you down here?" The footsteps started down the stairs. One set, then two. Jacob and Amelia appeared in the doorway of the main basement area, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. They looked so smug, so certain of their victory. Jacob in a crisp button-down shirt, Amelia in a sharp pantsuit, dressed for a corporate takeover. "What on earth are you doing down here?" Amelia asked, her nose wrinkled in distaste at the dusty air. "It smells like mildew." Elizabeth turned slowly to face them. Her expression was calm, her hands resting lightly on the tape player. "I'm waiting for you," she said, her voice even. Before I sign anything, there is one last thing Richard left for you, Jacob. Your inheritance. Jacob's eyes lit up with a greedy, proprietary gleam. He glanced around the basement, as if expecting to see a hidden safe or a strongbox. What is it? Where? It's not something you can hold, Elizabeth said softly. She gestured from the main basement area toward the open door of the workshop. It's in here. An heirloom of the spirit. Amelia scoffed. Oh, for God's sake, Elizabeth. Can you stop being so dramatic? We have a dinner reservation. But Jacob was already moving. His curiosity piqued. He stepped past her into the cold observation room, his eyes immediately drawn to the one-way mirror. A flicker of something recognition, nostalgia crossed his face. Amelia followed him, looking impatient and confused. What is this place? Amelia asked. Her arms crossed. Richard's workshop? It's just an empty room with a creepy mirror. It's not a mirror, Elizabeth said, her gaze fixed on Jacob. He wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the glass, just as he had all those years ago. Jacob, this is a waste of time, Amelia snapped. Let's just get the papers and go. Quiet, Jacob hissed. His attention locked on the room. This is the heirloom, Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the tension. A lesson. From your father. She reached out a steady hand and pressed the play button on the reel-to-reel player. For a moment, there was only the soft hiss and crackle of old magnetic tape. Then, a voice filled the small concrete room. It was young, terrified. It was a girl's voice, pleading, Please, just let me go home. I won't tell anyone. I swear, I won't tell anyone. My parents are probably so worried. Amelia froze. Her head snapped toward the tape player, her perfectly made-up face a mask of confusion. What is this? The voice on the tape sobbed. A raw, hopeless sound. Please, I just want to talk to my sister. Can I just talk to my sister, Amelia? Please. The name hung in the air, a poisoned dart. Amelia's face, which had been confused, now began to crumble. Her eyes widened, the blood draining from her cheeks. She looked from the tape player to Elizabeth, then to Jacob, her mouth opening and closing silently. That's not possible, she stammered, her voice a choked whisper. It sounds like your sister, doesn't it? Elizabeth said, her voice soft but relentless. It sounds like Sarah, the one who ran away to California 15 years ago. The one you never heard from again. The girl on the tape, Sarah, began to cry harder. And then another voice joined hers. A man's voice. Calm. Methodical. Cruel. It was Richard's voice. Now, Sarah, Richard's recorded voice said smoothly, we've been over this. Crying is not productive. We're here to work. We're here to break down the unnecessary parts of you. To find what's essential. Amelia let out a sound, a strangled gasp that was half scream, half sob. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with dawning, absolute horror, were fixed on her husband. Jacob stood like a statue carved from ice. He was pale, his jaw clenched, but his eyes were still on the glass. He was trapped between the past and the present, the recording and the reality. You! Amelia shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and animalistic. She launched herself at him, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. You knew, that was my sister, my baby sister. What did you do? What did he do? Richard's voice droned on from the tape, explaining some cold psychological theory of control as his victim wept. The sound was monstrous, obscene in the face of Amelia's explosive grief. You knew! she screamed again, her voice breaking. This house, this whole time, you were protecting him. You let me live in my sister's tomb. Jacob finally broke. His face, which had been a frozen mask, twisted into a snarl of pure rage. He shoved Amelia away from him. She staggered back, collapsing against the wall, her body racked with sobs. His fury was not directed at his weeping wife. It was for Elizabeth. You, he spat, his eyes burning with a hateful fire she recognized from his father. You couldn't just leave it alone. You had to ruin it. You had to desecrate this place. He lunged for her, his hands outstretched like claws, aiming for her throat, for the source of the words that had destroyed his world. He was going to silence her, just as his father had silenced so many others. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply stood her ground, her eyes meeting his. At that exact moment, the basement door at the top of the stairs didn't open. It splintered. Wood exploded inward as the door was kicked off its hinges. Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. State police, nobody move. The concrete room was flooded with light. Bright, blinding beams from tactical flashlights cut through the gloom. Figures in dark uniforms, armed with rifles, swarmed into the room, their shouts overlapping. Hands in the air! Get on the ground now! Jacob froze mid-lunge, his face a grotesque picture of shock and fury, caught in the blinding glare. Amelia was a crumpled heap on the floor, her wails echoing off the concrete walls. And standing calmly amidst the chaos was Elizabeth, bathed in the sudden cleansing light. Behind the police, a woman with a sharp face and a phone held high, its camera recording everything, pushed her way forward. Lena Petrova. Her lens captured it all. The weeping wife, the snarling son, the reel-to-reel player still spinning out its terrible sermon, and the old woman who had brought the temple crashing down. The flash of the camera was like a lightning strike, illuminating a scene of abject monstrosity for the entire world to see. The world dissolved into a strobing chaos of red and blue. The piercing shriek of sirens was the only sound that could cut through the thick, suffocating air of the basement. Uniformed bodies moved with urgent, controlled purpose, their faces grim, their voices clipped and low. Someone, a woman in a police uniform with kind, tired eyes, draped a scratchy wool blanket over Elizabeth's shoulders. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but the weight of it felt like a shroud. She was guided up the basement stairs, one step at a time, her hand barely touching the railing she had polished for 50 years. Each step was a lifetime. Outside, the night had been torn open. The quiet suburban street of Havenwood was a constellation of flashing lights, a swarm of vehicles. Neighbours stood in their bathrobes on their perfect lawns, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Then came the vultures. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs screeched to a halt. Men and women holding microphones and cameras surged forward, a human tide held back by a thin yellow line of police tape. Ma'am, Mrs. Sterling, is it true? What did you find in the basement? How long did you know? The questions were like stones, pelting her. How long did I know? The question echoed in the hollow space where her life used to be. She saw Jacob, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, being pushed into the back of a police car. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in them she saw no remorse, only the frustrated rage of a king whose castle had just been stormed. He wasn't sorry for the crimes. He was sorry he'd been caught. Amelia was a different story. She was crumpled on the curb, her body racked with guttural sobs that seemed to tear from the very earth beneath her. Her cries were not for her husband, but for a ghost, for her sister. The name Sarah was a constant broken refrain on her lips, a name Elizabeth now knew was on one of those horrible tapes. Amelia's world hadn't just been shaken, it had been unmade. She had been living a lie, married to the apprentice of her sister's tormentor. Maya Singh, her lawyer, materialized at her side, a small, solid anchor in the storm. Elizabeth, don't look at them. Don't say a word. We're getting you out of here. Maya led her to an unmarked car. As they drove away, Elizabeth looked back at the house. Her home. It was no longer a house. It was a crime scene. A tomb. The lights from the emergency vehicles made it look like a monster, breathing in and out in pulses of red and blue. The windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out at the circus it had created. Every memory she had of that place was now a lie, a carefully constructed set piece for a horror show she never knew she was part of. The first 48 hours were a blur of beige motel rooms, lukewarm coffee, and the drone of the television. The story was everywhere. The Havenwood House of Horrors. They called Richard the architect of pain. They called Jacob the prodigal son. They called her. They didn't know what to call her. The tragic widow? The oblivious wife? Some darker corners of the internet, the anonymous forums and comment sections, whispered a more sinister question. How could she not have known? For 50 years. She'd turn off the television. But the silence was worse. In the silence, she'd remember Richard, bringing her tea in the morning, his hand gentle on her shoulder. The memory was now poison. What had that hand done the night before? She remembered him working late in the basement. The faint thudding sounds he'd dismissed as the house settling. He had been settling his accounts, not the foundation. She remembered Jacob as a teenager, quiet and watchful, spending hours down there with his father, supposedly learning about blueprints and load-bearing walls. He had been learning a different trade entirely, a legacy of cruelty. Every kindness Richard had ever shown her was now suspect, a manipulation. Every gift was a gag. Every "I love you" was a nail in her coffin. The marriage hadn't been a prison. It had been the warden's private quarters, and she'd been just another fixture, a piece of furniture that made the room look normal. Amelia's shattered testimony had sealed Jacob's fate. Over and over, she told the police about her sister, Sarah, who had run away 15 years ago. Sarah, who had struggled with depression. Sarah, who had sought counseling from a respected family friend, the kind architect, Richard Sterling. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. Jacob had known. He had known what happened to Sarah, and he had married her sister anyway, bringing the serpent right back into the garden. The motive for getting Elizabeth out of the house was no longer just about property. It was about preservation. He needed to protect the workshop. He needed to continue the work. On the third day, there was a knock on the motel room door. Elizabeth expected Maya, or perhaps a detective with more questions. She opened it to find Chloe. Her granddaughter stood there, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a worn suitcase at her feet. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her gaze was steady. She had disowned her parents in a single scathing post on social media that had gone viral. "My father is a monster's shadow," it read. "My mother was his victim. I stand with my grandmother. I stand with the real victims." Chloe didn't say anything. She just stepped inside, dropped her bags, and wrapped her arms around Elizabeth. For the first time since the sirens had started, Elizabeth let herself break. She wept into her granddaughter's shoulder, 50 years of tears held back by a dam of polite smiles and quiet endurance. She cried for the life she thought she had, for the man she thought she'd loved, and for the women whose names she was only just beginning to learn. The next phase of her life began, not with a bang, but with a quiet, methodical purpose. The lead detective, a man named Harris with a face etched by too many grim cases, treated her not as a curiosity, but as a resource. An oracle. They set up a room for her at the station, away from the media glare. It was plain, functional, filled with evidence boxes, a large table, and a corkboard that was slowly being covered with the faces of smiling young women. Lost women. "Anything you can remember, Elizabeth," Harris would say, his voice gentle, no matter how small. So she remembered. She sat with the evidence: Richard's journals, the photo albums, the tapes. It was an act of excruciating archaeology, digging through the ruins of her own life. At first, it was agony. Listening to Richard's calm, therapeutic voice on the tapes as he systematically dismantled a young woman's psyche was like swallowing glass. Seeing the photos, he took portraits of his victims. Their eyes filled with a terror he had meticulously cultivated made her physically ill. But then something shifted. Chloe sat with her, a silent, supportive presence, refilling her water, placing a steadying hand on her arm. With Chloe there, the horror became manageable. The pain began to sharpen into a tool. She was the only one who could decipher Richard's cryptic notes, his coded language. "This symbol," she said one afternoon, pointing to a small, intricate swirl in the margin of a journal entry dated 1988. He used to doodle this on napkins. He called it his inspiration. He drew it right after a meeting with a new client, a young artist. Harris checked the board. He pulled down a photo of a woman named Maria Sanchez, a painter who had vanished in the fall of 1988. Her case file mentioned she was seeking a patron for her work. Richard had posed as one. Elizabeth's memory had just forged a new link in a chain that had been cold for decades. She worked tirelessly, her mind, once clouded by the fog of a controlled life, now sharp and clear. She connected a receipt for a specific type of rope to the disappearance of a hiker in 1995. She remembered a casual comment Richard made about a stubborn client that lined up perfectly with the timeline of a young law student who had fought back. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an instrument of justice. The work was gruesome, but it was also a form of atonement. Not for her complicity, because she was not complicit, but for her silence. A silence she hadn't known she was keeping. One day, a couple came to the station. They were old, frail. Their faces, a roadmap of grief. They were the parents of a girl named Laura, who had disappeared 40 years ago, one of Richard's first. Harris brought them to Elizabeth. The mother, a woman named Eleanor, clutched a tattered photograph. They said, you might know something." Elizabeth looked at the photo of the smiling girl. She didn't recognize the face. But then she thought of the boxes from the safe. Richard had kept trophies. Small, seemingly meaningless items. She described a small silver locket shaped like a hummingbird. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her husband held her steady. "It was a gift," he whispered, his voice cracking. For her 16th birthday, it was her favorite thing in the world. Elizabeth had given them back a piece of their daughter. She had given them an answer, however horrific. In their tearful gratitude, she found a sliver of peace. Her life had been built on a foundation of lies, but she could use those lies to give other families the truth. She could build something new from the rubble. The bond with Chloe became the new foundation of her world. They lived in a small, furnished apartment, a world away from the grand, dark house in Havenwood. They built a new routine: morning walks, quiet dinners, evenings spent not in front of the television, but talking. Chloe was hungry for the truth, for the stories Elizabeth had never been allowed to tell. "What was he like before?" Chloe asked one night. "He was charming," Elizabeth said, her voice distant. "Everyone thought so. He could command a room with a smile. He made you feel like you were the only person in the world. That was his greatest tool. He made the cage look like a pedestal. But you were strong, Grandma. You survived him." "Vit, surviving isn't the same as living, Chloe," Elizabeth said softly. "I'm only just learning how to do that." The legal proceedings against Jacob were swift. Amelia's testimony, combined with the mountain of evidence from the basement and Elizabeth's meticulous work connecting it to the cold cases, left him with no defense. He was a direct accomplice, a willing apprentice. He was sentenced to life in prison, his name forever linked to his father's monstrous legacy. With the trial over, one final piece of business remained. The house. It still stood, cordoned off, a blight on the neighborhood. Realtors and developers circled like sharks, smelling valuable land. The city council saw a prime piece of real estate. They made offers through Maya. They spoke of luxury condos, of commercial development, of moving on. Elizabeth listened to them all, her expression unreadable. For weeks, she said nothing. She let the offers pile up. Millions of dollars, a comfortable future for her and Chloe, far away from Havenwood. One morning she called Maya. "I've made a decision." They met with the mayor and the city council in a sterile conference room. The air was thick with expectation. They assumed she was there to negotiate her price. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, Chloe at her side. She looked smaller in the large chair, yet she commanded the room more effectively than Richard ever had. She didn't need a charming smile. She had the weight of truth on her side. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I've heard your offers. I appreciate your time. But you seem to be under a misapprehension. The house, the land, it is not for sale." A murmur went through the room. The mayor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sterling, with all due respect, the property is worth a substantial amount. It could fund a new chapter for you." "My new chapter has already begun," Elizabeth said, her eyes meeting his, "and it will not be funded by blood money. I will not profit from that place." She slid a document across the table to Maya, who then passed it to the mayor. "I am signing the deed over to the city of Havenwood. The land is yours, free of charge." The mayor looked stunned. He opened his mouth, but Elizabeth held up a hand. "It comes with one condition," she said, her voice hardening with a steel they had not expected. "A single, legally binding, non-negotiable condition. You will demolish the house, every last board, every nail, every single brick of that foundation. You will grind it into dust." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And in its place, you will build a garden. A public memorial garden. There will be no statues of men, no grand plaques, just trees and flowers and benches. It will be dedicated to the women whose lives were stolen on that land. Their names, and only their names, will be listed on a simple stone at the entrance. It will be a place of quiet remembrance, a place of peace. That is my price." There was a long silence. The council members looked at each other, then at the mayor. They saw the look on Elizabeth's face. This was not a negotiation. It was a decree. The day of the demolition arrived a few months later. It was a crisp, clear autumn morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Elizabeth and Chloe stood across the street, behind a temporary barrier with a small crowd of reporters and quiet onlookers. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. A huge yellow bulldozer rumbled to life, its engine a low growl that vibrated through the pavement. It lumbered forward, positioning itself before the front of the house. The house where Elizabeth had raised a son. The house where she had hosted dinner parties, planted roses, and slept next to a demon for half a century. The machine raised its massive steel arm, the claw-like bucket poised like a fist. For a moment, everything was still. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crunch of splintering wood and shattering glass, the bulldozer swung. The claw tore through the front porch, ripping away the facade. The living room was exposed to the morning light, a pathetic, dusty stage set. With each swing of the machine, another piece of the lie was torn away. The walls of the dining room where they'd shared holiday meals, the roof that had sheltered so much pain, the windows that had watched the world go by, hiding their terrible secrets. It was a slow, brutal, and deeply satisfying execution. As the last wall crumbled into a pile of brick and timber, the morning sun, no longer blocked by the monstrous structure, streamed across the street. It hit Elizabeth's face, warming her skin. Chloe looked at her grandmother. There were tears tracking silently down her own cheeks, but Elizabeth's eyes were dry. Her expression was not one of joy, not of triumph, not even of relief. It was something deeper, a profound and quiet emptiness. A clearing. She didn't smile. But for the first time in 50 years, she was no longer standing in the shadow of that house. The weight was gone. She was free.